My name is Dolores. I'm 23 years old, and the last thing my father ever said to me before I walked out was, "You don't matter in this family." It wasn't yelled. He didn't slam a door or raise his fist. He just said it flat, like it was the simplest fact in the world. And in that moment, I felt something break inside me, but not the way you think. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just realized he had finally spoken out loud what I had felt my whole life. Growing up, I was the kid nobody really saw. My brother Callum was the golden one. Every photo, every story, every dinner conversation seemed to circle around him. When I brought home straight A's, it barely earned me a distracted good job. When I won first place at a regional competition, my dad brushed it off because Callum had a soccer game that week. I was background noise in my own house, the extra in a movie I didn't ask to star in. By the time I turned 18, I already knew I'd be paying for my own future. Scholarships, side jobs, late-night studying. I hustled because nobody else was going to have my back. And honestly, that grind shaped me more than their neglect ever could. But it also carved a hollow space inside me, the kind where love was supposed to go. I remember the day I left Arlington like it was branded into my skin. March heat pressed against the windows as I taped up my last moving box. My friends Jasper and Rye were sweating through their shirts, lugging furniture into the U-Haul, while I stood there with one hand on the doorframe of my tiny apartment. My chest felt tight, not from sadness, but from something close to relief. This is it, I thought. This is the day I stop waiting for them to notice me. And they didn't. Not when I crossed state lines. Not when I signed my first lease in Oregon. Not when I celebrated my birthday alone with a cheap cake and a single candle. 6 months went by in silence. No calls, no texts, not even a, "Where are you?" The world might have thought I disappeared, but honestly, it felt like I was finally breathing for the first time. Oregon wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. A one-bedroom apartment with a narrow balcony, shelves filled with books I loved, and a job that didn't just pay the bills. It gave me purpose. Every morning I watered the herbs on my windowsill. Every night I cooked dinner without anyone criticizing me. It was quiet, but it was real. And then the phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen, a reminder that no matter how far I ran, the weight of their absence had a way of finding me. He didn't call to ask how I was, or to say he missed me. He called to summon me. And that's where everything started to unravel. Because here's the truth. You can erase a name from the dinner table, but sooner or later, that silence comes back louder than you ever imagined. When I picked up the phone that night, my father didn't even bother with, "Hello." His voice came through clipped, commanding, the way it always did when he wanted something. "You need to come home next weekend," he said. Not "how are you," not "where have you been," just an order, delivered like I was still a teenager waiting for permission to breathe. I remember staring at the ceiling in my little Oregon apartment, the hum of my laptop still in the background, and feeling that old heaviness crawl back over me. It wasn't sadness, it was recognition. I asked him why. There was a pause long enough to taste the irritation in his silence. Then, "Your brother's engagement dinner. Isa's parents want to meet the whole family. They're very traditional. It'll reflect badly if you don't show." There it was, the truth shining through every word. I wasn't being invited because they missed me. I was being summoned because I made their family portrait look incomplete. It wasn't the first time I'd been treated like a prop. When I was 8, I placed my honor roll certificate on the kitchen table, right where my mom sat with her tea every morning. She glanced at it, said, "Good job," without looking up from her phone, and that was it. That same week, Callum brought home a C+ on a math quiz and still got to pick dinner. I stopped expecting applause after that. By the time I was a teenager, it was crystal clear. Callum got the spotlight and I got the scraps. The year I won the regional science fair, I dragged home a trophy taller than me. My dad didn't even let me put it on the counter. "Let's not make a big deal," he said. "Your brother has finals." That was the last time I carried my achievements through that door. So when he demanded I show up for Callum's engagement, it felt like a rerun of every moment I'd been erased. My parents didn't want me at that dinner because they loved me. They wanted me because appearances mattered more than people. I told him no. Just like that. 2 letters I had never allowed myself to say before. No. The silence that followed was thick, charged like the air before a storm. Finally, he snapped, "If you don't show up, Dolores, you're out of the will." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. My entire existence in his mind had been reduced to leverage, to money he thought I couldn't live without. What he didn't know, because he had never bothered to ask, was that I was doing just fine on my own. Better than fine, actually. I had a steady job, savings with commas in it, and plans to buy a house. I didn't need their inheritance, so I said it calmly, the way you say something you know will hit its mark. I make more money than all of you combined. The line went dead after that, but the texts started rolling in. My mom with her fake sweetness, my brother with his confused pleading, my father with his rage disguised as disappointment, and for the first time in my life I didn't reply. You know, people often think betrayal comes with shouting, slam doors, or dramatic fights, but the sharpest kind is quieter. It's years of being ignored until you stop existing in your own home. Have you ever felt invisible in your family? Like your voice didn't matter? If you have, let me know where you're watching from. Because sometimes, sharing that truth is the first step to breaking free. As the days passed, the guilt trips turned into threats, then back into begging. But nothing in those messages ever sounded like love. They sounded like panic. Panic that their daughter, the background character they had always overlooked, might not play along anymore. And deep down, I realized something. It wasn't me who had walked away from them. They had walked away from me years ago. They just hadn't noticed until someone else did. By the 3rd day, my phone looked like a battlefield, missed calls stacked on top of each other, text bubbles flooding the screen. "Dolores, don't be difficult. Your brother's counting on you. Family should stick together." Family. That word felt like poison on their tongues. For them, family meant silence when it was convenient, obedience when it mattered to appearances, and guilt trips when they needed something from me. Then my mom finally called. Her voice was sugar-coated, but I could hear the strain underneath. "Sweetheart, this isn't like you," she said softly. "You've always been so respectful. Your brother needs you there. Isa's parents are very formal. Don't embarrass us." There it was again. Not "we miss you," not "we love you." Just "don't embarrass us." I told her simply, "I'm not going." Her tone sharpened. "It's just one dinner. Smile, say a few words, and you can disappear again afterward. That's all we're asking." "You mean like I already have?" I said. There was silence on the line, and then she hung up. I thought that would be the end of it, but Callum called next, and his voice, unlike theirs, carried something different. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you and Mom and Dad," he said, almost pleading, "but can't you just do this one thing? For me?" For a second, I almost softened. This was my brother, the boy I grew up with, the one who shared late-night cartoons and hand-me-down jokes, even if he stood by while I faded into the background. Maybe he really wanted me there. Not for them, but for himself. But then I remembered all the times he'd looked away, the years of silence when I needed someone to stand up for me, and suddenly his voice felt less like a lifeline and more like a trap. "No, Callum," I said, steady. "Not this time." He sighed heavily. "You're being selfish. You don't understand how important this is for me." And there it was, the mask slipping. He didn't care about me. He cared about how my absence would reflect on him. "I understand perfectly," I said. "That's why I won't come." The line went quiet, and then he muttered something I'll never forget. "Don't make me choose between you and them." But the truth was, he already had. That night, my grandmother Edith called. Her voice was calm, steady, the opposite of theirs. "Hi, sweetheart," she said warmly. "How's the air up there today?" "Cool and quiet," I told her, and I could hear her smile through the line. We talked about lavender, about the deer that sometimes wandered near my balcony, about little things that reminded me not everyone in my bloodline had failed me. And then she said gently, "They asked me to call you." I figured, I admitted. Let me guess. They want you to convince me to come back and play the part. They didn't use those words, she said. But yes. I laughed softly. Of course. That's all I've ever been to them, a part in their show. She didn't argue. She never did. Instead, she said, You don't owe them anything. Not after the way they treated you. That was why I always answered when Edith called. She never tried to rewrite history. She saw me even when no one else did. But the texts didn't stop. They shifted from guilt to anger to something sharper. And then the real twist came. Callum sent me a message late one night. If you don't show up, Isa's parents might start asking questions. I'll have no choice but to tell them you've been unstable, that you've cut yourself off from the family. Don't make me do that. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. So this was it. The brother who once begged me to stand by his side was now ready to throw me under the bus if it meant saving face. That was the second betrayal, the one that cut deeper than the first. Parents overlook you, you can almost expect that. But your own brother painting you as unstable to protect his wedding? That's a different kind of wound, I typed back, my fingers shaking but my voice steady when I finally spoke into the phone. Do whatever you need to, Callum. But remember, lies don't hold forever. They crack. He never replied. That night, I sat on my balcony, the Oregon air cool against my skin. And I realized something important. Their panic wasn't about losing me. It was about being exposed. Without me to play the invisible daughter, their picture-perfect family didn't look so perfect anymore. And for once, I didn't feel small because of it. I felt powerful. The wedding weekend arrived and I stayed exactly where I belonged, hundreds of miles away, in my little Oregon apartment, watering the lavender on my balcony. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. But silence doesn't stretch across the country without being noticed. Especially not in a room full of traditional in-laws with sharp eyes and sharper questions. Grandma Edith called me the morning after the ceremony. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Well, she said, her voice edged with both amusement and tension, the wedding happened. I leaned against my kitchen counter, the phone pressed to my ear. And? It was tense, she admitted, the kind of tension you can feel in your neck, even when everyone's smiling. I pictured it easily, my parents stiff in their chairs, Callum glancing nervously at the door every 5 minutes, Isa fidgeting with her napkin under the table. What did they say about me? I asked quietly. Edith chuckled, but it wasn't out of joy. They tried, Dolores. First they told Isa's parents you were sick, then they said work had called you away, then something about a conference out of state. But Isa's mother, she's not the kind of woman you can fool. I closed my eyes. She pressed them. Hard, Edith confirmed. She asked why you weren't at the engagement dinner either. Why she only learned you even existed a few weeks ago. Why your name never came up until invitations went out. And what did Mom say? No one knows exactly what was said after the rehearsal dinner, Edith replied. But she came out pale and quiet. I think Isa's mother read her like a book. I almost smiled at the thought. My absence had finally spoken louder than my presence ever had, but Edith wasn't finished. During the reception, Isa's mother cornered your brother. Asked him directly, "Why haven't I met your sister? Where has she been?" I could almost hear the clink of glasses, the polite laughter covering the unease. And Callum? He tried to downplay it, Edith said. Told her you've been unstable. That you distanced yourself from the family, but Isa's mother didn't look convinced. She watched him the rest of the night like she was peeling layers off an onion. My chest tightened, not from guilt, but from something colder. There it was. My brother choosing the lie he'd threatened me with. Only this time, it wasn't just words in a text. It was public. And Isa? I asked. She looked upset, Edith admitted, barely smiled through the ceremony, kept glancing at the entrance like she expected you to walk in and prove them all wrong. I let that picture settle in, the bride distracted, the groom nervous. The parents of the bride suspicious, and my own family unraveling under the weight of their lies. "They still think this is about a dinner party," I murmured. "No," Edith said gently. "Isa's parents saw the imbalance, the omissions, the damage. They won't forget it." I exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and grim satisfaction. For once, it wasn't me defending myself. The truth had a way of leaking into the cracks all on its own. Later that evening, Edith called again. "They're still talking," she said without preamble. "Isa's parents asked Callum directly why you've been erased. Why your name was never spoken, why your family acts like you don't exist." "And what did he say?" I asked. "He tried to laugh it off, but it only made things worse. Isa's mother doesn't like being lied to, and Callum, well, you can't build a marriage on half-truths. Not when your in-laws already suspect the foundation is cracked." I imagined my parents' faces, the desperation underneath their polished smiles. For so long they had silenced me. But now, my absence was the loudest voice in the room. That night, while the remnants of their wedding feast grew cold, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the irony. They had erased me for years, pretending I didn't matter, and now the very people they wanted to impress were asking about me, demanding explanations they couldn't give. It wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense, no shouting matches, no storming into the reception in a dramatic gown, just truth, catching up to them in the most public way possible. And the best part? I didn't lift a finger. I stared out the window at the Oregon pines, the quiet stretching around me like a shield. For the first time, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like the ghost they couldn't bury. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't showing up. It's staying gone. After the wedding, the silence didn't come back. It was replaced with noise. Endless, desperate noise. A week later, Grandma Edith called me again. "They're still talking about it," she said without needing to explain what it was. "Isa's parents haven't let it go. They've started asking directly, why your family acted like you don't exist, why your name only showed up when it was already too late, and Callum, well, he's struggling." I leaned against my kitchen counter, phone warm in my hand. "Struggling how?" "He tried to smooth it over, but Isa's mother isn't the kind to forget. She asked why you weren't at the engagement, why you weren't at the wedding, why she's never seen a single photo of you in their house. She doesn't like being lied to, Dolores. And right now, Callum is realizing those lies don't hold forever." I pictured my brother, fidgeting under the gaze of his new in-laws, trying to keep the polished smile intact. I didn't feel glee, but I didn't feel sorry either. What I felt was stillness, like watching ripples spread across a pond after dropping a stone. The truth had landed, and now the waves were reaching farther than he could control. That same week, my parents started circling too. Messages poured in. "We need to talk. Family doesn't abandon family. Think about your brother's future." Not one of them said, "We miss you." Not one of them said, "We're sorry." And then, the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address, but the blocky handwriting was unmistakable, my father's, careful and rigid, as though neatness could rewrite history. I held it at my mailbox for a long time, the weight of it heavier than the paper itself. I didn't open it. Instead, I walked straight to the fire pit in my backyard, struck a match, and dropped it in. I watched the flames curl the edges inward, blackening each line until the whole thing crumbled into ash. I didn't need to read the words. I already knew what they said. Commands disguised as concern, guilt disguised as love. The next morning, I signed the final paperwork on my house. 3 bedrooms, cedar siding, a small yard for a garden, my name on every line, no cosigner, no conditions, just mine. It felt like breathing fresh air after years of holding it in. Jasper and Rye texted me about flights. They wanted to see the place, help me plant the first flowers. My boss congratulated me. Edith called, her voice warm, asking if I'd decided on furniture. These were the voices that filled my life now, steady and real. And yet, the shadows of my family still lurked. 2 weeks later, Edith called again. "They're asking around," she said. "Your parents, your brother, they want to know who has your new number, your address. They even asked me, 'You didn't tell them, right?' I asked quickly. "Of course not," she said firmly. "I told them if you wanted to talk, you would." I breathed out slowly, the tension leaving my shoulders. "Thank you." "They're nervous, Dolores," Edith continued, "not just about you, but about what Isa's parents might do. About what it might mean for Callum's future. They're afraid this won't just go away. And they were right, because it wasn't just about one wedding or one dinner or one absent daughter. It was about years of silence that had finally been noticed by someone else. It was about the cracks in their carefully constructed image. For once, the consequences weren't mine to carry. They were theirs. I looked around my new kitchen, the sunlight spilling across the counters, the fresh towels folded neatly by the sink, the window above the stove that overlooked the pines. This wasn't just a house, it was mine. A space where no one could erase me, where my name wasn't an afterthought. That night, I lit a candle by the sink, the soft glow filling the room. And as I unpacked boxes, I realized I wasn't just building a home, I was building a life, one where I chose who got to be in it. 6 months later, my backyard was alive with voices. Jasper manned the grill like it was a science experiment. Rye danced barefoot to a playlist I didn't even remember making. A folding table sagged under the weight of potluck dishes. Quiche, sesame noodles, a casserole someone swore was a family recipe. A neighbor's golden retriever flopped at my feet. Across the yard, my coworker's little daughter slipped a plastic bracelet over my wrist and declared, "You're my aunt now." The fun kind, I laughed, slipping it on like it was made of gold. "I'll take that," I told her. Later, as twilight settled in, someone from down the street asked me quietly, "Do you have family back east?" I didn't hesitate. "Not anymore." There was a pause, but I smiled, gesturing to the table where Jasper was laughing so hard he spilled lemonade down his shirt, where Rye twirled barefoot under the string lights, where the little girl was chasing fireflies with sticky fingers. "But I have this," I said. And I meant it. When the yard finally quieted, and the fireflies blinked near the fence, I stood alone at the edge of my garden. The bracelet still hugged my wrist. My house glowed softly behind me. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in my 23 years, that was enough. The night after my friends left, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of silence I had known growing up. This silence wasn't heavy, it was honest. It was the sound of a life I had chosen for myself. I stood at the kitchen window, the soft glow of the lamp spilling across the counters, the little plastic bracelet still wrapped around my wrist. It looked cheap, fragile even, but to me it was priceless, because for once someone had looked at me and seen more than a placeholder. They'd called me aunt. They'd given me a role not out of duty or convenience, but out of love. And in that moment, I realized something simple but powerful. Family isn't always the people you share blood with. Sometimes it's the people who show up for you, who laugh in your backyard, who call just to ask how the air feels that morning. The letter I burned weeks earlier had been the last attempt to pull me back into a role I never chose. But I wasn't a background character anymore. I wasn't the invisible daughter waiting for scraps of attention. I was the author of my own story. It didn't erase the pain of the past. It didn't magically heal the years of silence or the sting of my brother's betrayal. But it gave me something stronger, the courage to stop measuring my worth through their eyes. And that's what I want you to take away from this. Your value isn't defined by the people who overlook you. It's defined by the choices you make when you finally see yourself clearly. Sometimes walking away isn't abandonment, it's survival. Sometimes it's the only way to finally breathe. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever built your strength from the ground up, I want you to share your story in the comments. And if this journey touched you even a little, please like this video and subscribe. Because the more we share these truths, the more people will realize they're not alone. As I turned off the lights and the house settled into quiet, I smiled to myself. This wasn't the ending I had once imagined. No tearful reunions, no dramatic apologies. It was better. It was mine. And that's the thing about breaking free. Once you do, you never go back to living in the shadows.